talking about objective morality today, right?
Yeah, if we can.
Sure we can.
Yeah, so I just wanted to know, well, I assume you guys believe in or advocate for subjective morality. Is that true?
For me, it depends on how you're defining it, right? Because I believe that we have moral tendencies that are not subjective, right? So in other words, if morality were 100% subjective, it would be nothing because there would be no metric. There'd be no way to measure it, right? But we have, for example, animal behavioral psychologists who measure for moral tendencies in other species, kind of saying, well, what other species exhibit any kinds of moral behaviors, like the capacity to deceive or the capacity to express guilt or the capacity to empathize. And so we have these metrics that as a social species we're capable of that I believe are objective, right? We're born, they're inborn. We didn't choose them. We didn't say, I'm going to go out and foster and develop empathy as an individual. It's part of our species, just like other social species exhibit in many ways. So that aspect of morality, I think, is objective, and that's what makes it measurable. But then you have the other aspect, which is, okay, so you have this sense of fairness about you that we see in a few other species. And so, but what does that mean when you ask an individual, is this particular interaction fair? Now you're going to get different answers, right? So now it starts to become a little more subjective because individuals start to put their experience to it and they start to say, well, in this case, I kind of see it from this angle and from that. But if I look at it this other way, I kind of see the other person's point. Or maybe I think the other person is just being completely unreasonable. But a lot of that is going to start coming down to individual experiences and how we assess particular interactions or, particular situations. So when you get into a situational framework, now you've got more subjective inputs coming into it. But I do think that there is an objective foundation for morality. Does that make sense?
Wow. Yeah,
okay.
That was a lot. I like that.
Oh, well, cool. Thank you.
Another way to approach this is you can say that we're striving for well-being, and we want to make sure that to increase the well-being of humans and those things that increase well-being are morally good, and things that hinder well-being are morally bad.
But even then, you're going to have these subjective things where it's like there's some harm that's coming with this, but there's some good that can. And so, because we are, so for example, we would tend to look at cutting off someone's arm as like an immoral thing to do. But if you're cutting off their arm because there's a flesh-eating bacteria that you're trying to stop to save their life, then somebody might say, well, yeah, okay, so you're clearly harming the person. Cutting off someone's arm is not harming them. That is harm to a person, right? That even if at the end of the day you say it's because we're gonna assign the blame to the disease,
right.
And not the doctor for slicing off someone's arm, it is still harm to the person. They come out of it with one less arm, and they're gonna have to deal with that. But at the same time, their life is saved, and I think people generally would understand. Okay, so you did this for some greater, thing, because we aren't. God-like, and we can't just wave a wand and make the flesh-eating bacteria go away. We have to make a decision to harm them in a smaller way than a larger way. And so even when you're using well-being, you're going to have these sort of weighted sort of things where one person or a person might say, I'd rather die than lose my arm.
Sure.
Right? And so you've got a person who's like, well, to them, they don't want to lose their arm. It means that much to them. And there's going to be these subjective values and weights to even those things, kind of no matter what you use, right? And I mean, even when you look at religion, right, even people within the same church are going to have disputes about what is intended as correct or not correct based on their biblical interpretations. Because I see they have you listed as theistic, and so I'm just kind of throwing out there that even within a religious community, you're going to have disputes about what would be a fair interaction, even with the guidance of your Bible or whatever.
Right. I would advocate, that's objective. There's a difference between objective and absolute, obviously.
Yeah, I agree.
But going back to what Don was saying, and I've heard the argument made many times for, good versus not good or bad, whatever. But why is it that morality has to gear towards that what is good. Does that
Well,
make sense?
morality is I would say, a concept that is unique to humans, or human morality is unique to humans, and it's about how humans are going to get along and work together to sort of get the most of us to the next generation or whatever. And if you want to assert that there's some God that knows better than us, there's a lot of evidence that you would need to provide that somehow they know better than us. I think that when you compare secular morality to religious morality, we've figured out that slavery is wrong, and the Bible still advocates for it, and the God still advocates for it because the God hasn't come down and made a correction.
And I would just add that when I think in terms, like good and bad to me are kind of ambiguous terms. And so let's look at something that we tend to have a little bit more of a fine point on, something like justice, right? The concept of justice. Okay. And whether or not a particular society is treating people justly. Depending on where you live, you're going to have different attitudes about that. But there are times when lots of people that live within that very society say our society is not just and we don't like it and we feel oppressed, right? People that are within that society may disagree with the justice that is being put down by an authoritarian source. And so what happens is people and also dogs and chimpanzees have this concept of when they're not being treated fairly, when they're being treated in a way that is less beneficial to them than another individual. And how this has generally been tested is in treats, giving them treats for assigned tasks, and whether or not they care if they get a treat or don't get a treat when someone else gets a treat. And there is evidence that shows that there's a negative response to them observing that someone else gets a reward and they don't get a reward. So that would be the sort of internal sense of justice, right? And different animals have different capacities for it and even different sense of what is just. So dogs, for example, seem to behave similarly if they're rewarded regardless of the type of reward, whereas chimpanzees tend to start acting negatively when they don't get a reward that's as good. So they're actually looking at evaluation of the type of reward. And that's more in line with kind of how humans view it, right? We don't just see a reward like, oh, he got paid and I got paid and we're happy. If you find out your coworker who has the same title as you is making $25,000 a year more, you're going to be like, hey, wait a minute, that's not cool. And so you have this sort of sense of justice about yourself. So then the question comes out, how do we gauge justice somewhere else, right? So we're watching a situation and we're saying, is this just, is this not just? And we're looking at a society where maybe a lot of people would agree that this does not comport with justice, that what's happening here is really bad. People are being sent to camps and genocidally killed, and people are being, reporters are being murdered, and some people are just being disappeared because they disagree with, political opinions. And so we see this thing, and it's like, what a terror of a society this is. And all of us are like, this is really not okay. This is really unjust. What it demonstrates is people don't have to comport with justice. There's no compulsion, right? Like a society can get away with injustice for as long as it can get away with injustice. And unless somebody stops it, it's going to continue in the way that it continues. What you're kind of asking when you say, why does it have to be good, would be, why does it have to be just, right? So what is the impetus that would make us want to ensure justice for someone else? Right? I mean, isn't that kind of what you're asking?
Kind of. But going back to your justice part, if a society, regardless, well, I guess it's kind of hard because, our society, we're a democratic republic and we vote. But if we lived in a society that didn't have a vote, if something was happening, how can we ultimately say that what society X is doing over here on the right is wrong because our society here doesn't
Right.
do that. Like, I mean, there has to be
Right. No,
kind of
I agree. The metric should never be, this is not how we do it, therefore it's wrong. Right? The metric of what is just isn't whatever I do. Justice has about it a sense of fairness and whether people are being treated with equity. Right? Are we being treated equally, or is there inequality? And you can measure inequality, right? Because there's metrics by which you can tell if somebody is in poverty, is somebody starving, is somebody being brutalized, is somebody... These are things that we can actually quantify and observe. And so the question becomes, do we want to be in a world where people are brutalized, people are abused, people... and where the rest of us just sit back and say, this is a fine thing. This is where, to me, that objective part of the morality that I was talking about earlier kicks in. Now, what we have generally as people is an innate sense of we get upset when we see an injustice, right? Most people, when they see something that they consider to be unjust, they have a negative reaction, just like the chimp and just like the dog. We are going to have that. Now, the question becomes, do I want to suppress that and say, I don't care that I'm watching this injustice and that this is disturbing to me? Or should I be disturbed by something I'm not? Like you're saying, if you're enculturated to something, like let's say that I live in a society where women are treated like in a horribly objectified way and where they're raped or beaten if they get out of line. If I grew up in that society, I might think that's perfectly fine. Right? This is perfectly okay. And that's where it comes down to, it's not just how I was raised, right? You have to look even at that and say, okay, so I've been taught this is fine and it doesn't bother me to see it, but should this bother me to see it? Should this be one of those things that I look at and I say, that is an injustice? Would I want to be objectified, beaten, raped? Would that be okay if it was me in that position in society instead of this other person? And this is where the equity comes in, which is one of those other aspects of moral tendencies that we measure. Do we have a sense of equity, right? Do I have a sense that this thing is like me? And as human beings, we actually do, right? We have the capacity, even as children, to recognize human faces above other species faces. Like we have a better capacity to recognize other humans. So we do see people in a unique way where we recognize you are one of those things like me. And so we have a sense of equity. So the question is, do we want to just suppress the morality or not? And I think that when you kind of look at the large picture of the world, it sort of becomes obvious that the better we make it for people, the more equity and the more justice and the more that things just seem to get better for everybody. The less we let some groups get abused, the better it kind of is for us all. And I think we feel better about it because we are innately geared toward these things. I mean, does that make sense to you?
Yeah. So with your last points on what you were talking about, like, should we solely base them on our own feelings, or should we have a set feeling, or is there something outside of both of that we should appeal to for?
Yeah, I think that we do have an innate reaction to injustice, but the problem is that when you're raised in a situation where you're taught that this is just or this is okay to do to somebody else, you tend to not really all those empathetic things that you would normally feel toward that person can sort of be headed off in a way where you don't really care. Like that's why you had this huge genocidal issue in Germany in World War II, right? That's why you could kill all these people and brutalize all these people, because to some degree there were some people who simply were just like, oh, they're different than me. They're not the same. They didn't have that. They weren't using their sense of equity and their sense of empathy and that recognition.
The first thing that goes in a war
right.
is you vilify your...
As soon as you start to objectify people and dehumanize them, that to me is the first step toward atrocity. To me, that when I see an objectification or a dehumanization of some group, when I look at that, I think you have just crossed the line into horrible.
Right. Yeah, I can agree with that, and I think too it kind of gets both deep and confusing, because I mean you can make the argument. Not that I am making the argument, but one can make the argument that, if we're using the Nazis for the death camps and the Jews, that they were appealing to emotion to okay their behavior.
Yeah, they were getting people angry, but they weren't appealing to the moral tendencies, right? Anger is not a moral tendency. You might react angrily to seeing an injustice, but anger is not a moral tendency. The moral tendencies are those things that promote social cohesion and promote unity and bonding between individuals within a species. And so not all emotion is necessarily morally related, right? There are moral tendencies, and they will evoke certain feelings and reactions in people. But the feelings themselves that are secondary to those things that are innate to us, like empathy, equity, fairness, guilt, obligation. The moral tendencies are those aspects of the person that we experience that promote bonding, not that promote savagery. That would not be a defined as a moral tendency.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that, but I still think there's, and again, I'm not making the argument, but I think someone along the line could make the argument for, justifying that behavior, I guess.
Well, sure, and they have. I mean, we've seen it. You're not simply being hypothetical. I mean, we watched it happen. And they did try to say that this was a moral thing to do. And I guess what I'm saying is that when we actually look at moral tendencies, right, and we look at this from a more evaluative standpoint, what we see is that it actually didn't comport with moral behavior toward other people, right? I mean, it was demonstrable that you can't be empathetic, and you can't, and I'm not even saying that I think what they did was more of an argument that we should be able to justifiably withhold moral behavior from this group. They weren't saying it necessarily. They might have labeled it in essence, that this was a good thing to do or the right thing to do. But what they were actually doing was saying, we think we have grounds to withhold moral behavior from a particular demographic. We don't have to be moral toward this group. We can abuse them. We can do all these things to them and treat them like non-humans because we don't have to look at them as human. And so first thing they did was sort of pull back all the morality from this particular demographic, and then they were able to do whatever they wanted to do to them.
Right. But there still is something that's, even though that's what they're saying, that's what they're advocating for, there's still something outside of them that is the actual authority, even if they don't recognize it or not, right?
I think what you're saying is this is your view, because that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that ultimately they have some innate features that they can disregard or they can go with, and they have to make those choices. But when they make those choices, they have to deal with other people like Don and myself who are going to make the choice to try and stop them. Because we're not going to look at that and say, oh, yeah, this is fine that you're just gassing people to death by the millions. We're not going to look at it that way. And so they are going to have to deal with the reality of other human beings who are saying that you have to continue to apply morality to these people, that you can't just simply treat them in such an immoral way.
Right. And I think you would get, Christians and other religious people to jump on that train with you.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I agree.
That.
Yeah, I agree. I think in the past
Hopefully
that's
the
been
majority
the
of
case.
people, right?
Yeah, I think generally, and see, that's the thing with me is I think generally people are going to go with their morality. I think there are very few Christians who are going to do something they believe is wrong because the Bible tells them so. They are sadly the most active, politically powerful Christians because other Christians tend to just sort of be a more liberal live and let live variety who are just trying to be good people and work in the soup kitchen and have the family to go to church and do the picnic afterwards.
Right, and they rationalize the disconnect.
That to me is like the average Christian. The average person going to church is not the person who's trying to shove their religion down someone else's throat. I think most people who are Christians are just living their lives and probably don't think twice except to go to church on Sunday and bring the kids for Bible school and cookies and whatever.
Right, whatever, regardless if you're an atheist or a Christian or active in politics or not, I think, we're all trying to exert some kind of moral standard.
Right. And I think it's important to note that when we talk about like these weird Christians that are all like, the anti-gay, anti-trans, like really, really hostile toward many different demographics, like anti-women's rights, like when you have that group of Christians, for example, what they've done is they've adopted an authoritarian sort of culture, right? Basically, there's this list of rules, and I must follow them regardless of how I feel about it or what I think is right. I just have to do what I'm told here. And that's kind of what a lot of people said during Nuremberg, right? I was just doing what I was told. And
Right.
so you have this idea of this authoritarian sort of dictate and mandate for here are the rules. And once you start telling people to do that, what you're actually doing is saying, don't use your moral judgment, ignore your moral tendencies, and follow this list of rules. And I think that's kind of, even though there is some risk involved with just letting people, follow their innate morality and try to do what's best, I think there's a greater risk involved of making that sort of hard and fast list of rules and saying you just simply follow the rules and it doesn't, the outcomes are irrelevant. And
well, if you study the development of moral tendencies, there is a sort of a phase that kids go through that's very rules based because they don't.
Sure, black and white thinking.
The whole
Right.
idea of working out conflicting issues and challenges based on values and these sorts of things, that's actually very hard work. And it's much easier to have a set of rules. It's like, oh, this is situation A, I'm going to follow the rule. And so it's sort of a lesser developed, moral sense of development, and eventually most folks outgrow that and go on to later phases. One of the real problems with rules is you can't have a rule for everything, and if you start having rules that contradict each other, then you've got a big mess.
Yeah.
And so the whole thing is just a non-starter.
Yeah.
And so I look at the Bible. It's a rules-based morality, big time. Right? It's follow these rules, and well, they're crappy rules, and they contradict, and it's just an obvious failure.
Yeah, I think to me the most important thing is I have difficulty labeling following a rule set as a morality, because to me what makes us moral agents is that moral judgment, right? That we actually consider a situation and we weigh it and we think about it, or that even if it results in you just going with what you feel is most fair, to me that's more moral than following a rule. If you're just simply following the rule without any good reason to believe that it's the best action. So when people talk about like a rules-based morality, like what Don was talking about, I look at that and I tend to think of it more as an ethic, right? So there's this ethic that says, is this a right action? Well, is it defined in the rules as this? Yes, then it's a right action. That's an ethic that appeals to like a list of rules. Basically, does it conform to the rules? If yes, then it's the right action.
Yeah. It's fine for robots.
Well, and it's also fine in business, for example, right? So you have business ethics where you have things that can change. A business ethic doesn't necessarily mean that it's like a moral or right thing to do. So like in real estate, for example, they have like this rule that if you're working with a real estate agent, you're not allowed to solicit other agents while you're under contract with that original agent.
Right,
Now,
right.
there are some people who want to get a realtor and they're like, why shouldn't I be able to shop it? Like I could shop other things. If I wanted a plumber, I could go and get other plumber. And if the board of realtors said tomorrow, we're changing that rule and we're going to let clients go out and solicit realtor, then that would be the new rule. It's not right or wrong. It's an ethic. Right? So it just has to do with these are our particular rules and standards. This is what we use. This is our philosophy of why we use them. And sometimes we rewrite the rules or we adjust the rules to, and it doesn't mean that the prior rules were bad or that these are good. Or it's just an ethic. There is no good or bad about it. It's an ethic. And when you're just simply, when somebody asks you, is this okay? And you run to the book and you look it up, you're not being moral. You might be being ethical, right? Like you're basing it on an ethic. And so I don't tend to look at that sort of rules-based, quote, morality as any morality at all, because if you're not exercising moral judgment, if you're not being a moral agent, I don't know how you can say that what you're doing is even related to morality.
Right. Like, I would say when it comes to morality, to morals, you often hear, especially from the atheist onto the Christian, don't legislate your morality, but in all actuality, we're all trying to legislate morality. It's just what morality is the right one and which is the set standard.
Yeah, my thinking about legislation is generally that we're not legislating morality, but no laws should ever be immoral. Right? We should never pass immoral legislation that is like harmful to people or that does harm or that allows massive harm to people. But at the same time, what we're trying to do with law is just make a harmonious interaction in a large public setting, right? You just want to make sure people aren't hurting each other every day. Whereas with morality, it's really more about like a social aspect of how we view other humans and how we treat them and whether or not we respect or regard them. The law doesn't make me respect you. It just makes me behave in a certain way to not put you at some sort of risk.
Harm, yeah.
Yeah. And obviously, if there's a law that makes me do things that are really bad and horrible to you, that would be an immoral law. And I would say, okay, the legislation can't be immoral, but it doesn't necessarily have to be moral. It can be totally benign, right? It doesn't have to have any moral value at all.
And over the long arc of time, I think our laws have become more promoting freedom and more promoting equality. And I think that in the long run, those are good things, right?
Well, we're trying to balance the individual freedoms with the social safety. Basically, that's what you're always trying to balance. And every time you get anywhere close to that line is when you get controversy.
Yeah.